In this training, we'll be exploring how we can use cognitive theory to guide distance learning lesson design. So a key question is, what is learning? Well, learning is the integration and connection of new learning and understanding with previous learning and understanding. So, biologically, learning is the formation or strengthening of connections. And that's really important to keep coming back to. Learning is the creation of connections, connecting new learning to old learning. It's integration of knowledge into what we already know. But learning doesn't just happen. No, in fact, there's quite a rigorous process involved in turning that data into actionable wisdom. But before we get to the wisdom, that learning arrives to us as messy, isolated, abstract data. And so we need to process that in order to turn that into anything meaningful. And so we first give context to that. And that data then becomes information. It's contextualized and it's organized. Then we give that information meaning and it becomes knowledge. It's integrated to prior learning. And then finally, we give insight and suddenly that knowledge becomes wisdom. So how does that work? Well, the data would be red, and then the information would be the traffic light is showing red. Then the knowledge would be, I'm driving towards the traffic light and it's showing red. And the wisdom would be, oh my goodness, I'm driving towards the traffic light, it's showing red, I better stop the car. And that's the process of learning. Now, there is so much data in the world around us. It's infinite. And we are blessed with an infinite capacity for learning. Throughout your lifetime, you will never run out of space for your learning. And think about what you already know. It's fantastic. Millions of words, millions of ways to express those words in a different order, with different tone. You know that grass is green, the sky is blue, what goes up must come down. You are incredible. There's an infinite amount of data in the world, an infinite amount of space in your brain to accommodate it. But actually, the business of processing that information to turn it from data into learning, into wisdom, requires a lot of cognitive effort or cognitive load, and it is very limited. And that really restricts the access of the infinite amount of data in the world getting into the brain. Imagine Wembley Stadium and all the football supporters trying to get in through just one turnstile. Cognitive load is the effort involved in processing information in our working memory and then integrating it into our long-term memory. And there are three types of cognitive load. The first is intrinsic load, and this is the effort that's innately involved in the task. So 2 plus 2 has a low intrinsic load, whereas 479 add 673 has a higher intrinsic load. The extraneous load refers to the effort involved in processing extra information or unnecessary information. And finally, you have the germane load, and that's the effort, the load that's left in order to process the intended learning. And so, if our intrinsic load or extraneous load is too high, that will suppress our ability to learn because we won't have sufficient germane load available to process the intended learning. And all this effortful processing takes place in the working memory. And I think it's really helpful to think about the working memory as being like a working table where we lay out everything that we need to work with in order to achieve our goal. Now, it's called the working memory because it's where we temporarily work with the information before we consolidate it as long-term learning. And the role of the working memory is to temporarily store the information while we work with it, to retrieve information from our long-term memory, to process and mix information, and to work towards current goal. Nothing massive like to be ruler of the world, but short-term goals like to open the door, to solve the sum. So what does this mean in the context of learning in maths, for example? Well, if we're adding two numbers, we need to temporarily store information. We need to store the numbers, the numerals. We also need to retrieve information from our long-term memory. We need to retrieve the process of adding. What do we do? How do we do it? We also need to process and mix the information and make sure that it's organised in a way that we can work with. And throughout all that, we need to make sure that we're working towards the current goal of adding. We keep that in mind. Now, one of the reasons that your working memory is so busy is because it is processing everything. And I mean everything, every bit of data in the room, it's processing without you even knowing, without your permission. An example of that is the last time you were at a party and you're talking to somebody and they're really interesting. You're giving them all your focus, or at least you think you are, but then you hear your name from across the room. Someone just used your name. Well, your working memory has processed that information and it decides it's important, so it flags it to you, it alerts you that somebody is talking about you across the other side of the room, and suddenly there's a conflict. You want to pay attention to the person you're talking to, but you're distracted now by who is talking about you across the other side of the room. And so the fact is, you have no control over what your brain processes, because your subconscious, your working memory, is processing every piece of data it is exposed to. And only once it's organised that in a way that you understand, it's turned it into information and knowledge, can it dismiss it. And that's why you've already read the sign on the screen that says, do not read this. Come on, take some control over yourself. So all of that processing, temporarily storing the information, retrieving information from the long-term memory, processing and organising information so that it makes sense to you and you can work out whether you need that information or not in order to achieve your current goal. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of cognitive load. And that's why we need to give more thought, not just to what we want the students to know, but how we're going to share that information so that learning becomes as efficient as possible. So take this jigsaw of a cat made out of geometric shapes that I made. If I want a student to understand how to put that together, the way that I present the shapes makes a big difference. You can see when the shapes are organised in a way that is similar to the way that they're organised with the cat, it helps. The more we move the shapes around, the more difficult it is for the students. And if we throw in lots and lots of other shapes and information and data, then it becomes even more difficult still. So I want to explore with you now Mayer's 12 principles of multimedia learning. These 12 principles are a summary of extensive research and study into cognitive theory and have been proven to have a big effect size on the learning of all students. As we try and foster and support learning in a completely different context, these principles become more relevant than ever. And if we apply these principles to our distance learning, we will be ensuring that all students are learning to their full potential. But before we introduce the 12 principles, he does give further guidance. And one thing that's hugely important is targeted learning. It's really important that students know what the learning intention is, that we give a really clear learning objective, even in a distance learning setting where we're trying to simplify things. It's also really important that we give clear steps for success. Imagine if I said to you, right, the learning intention is for you to drive me home, but I didn't tell you where I lived or how to get there. That's the situation that many students find themselves in quite regularly when we don't share with them sufficient success criteria. Now, the success criteria is even more important than the learning intention. Students need it. Otherwise, how else are they going to judge whether they're being successful? Well, they might look towards their peers. If they're already a high attainer, then they're likely to look towards a student that isn't as good as them. And they'll think, yeah, I'm doing pretty well, thank you. If they're a lower attainer, they're going to look towards students who are perhaps achieving more and become disenfranchised. And they might acquire that sense of learned helplessness that we've spoken about in other sessions. And so the first principle, and perhaps the most important, is the coherence principle. And this is concerned with removing all the extraneous information in order to reduce the extraneous load. So, what does that mean? Well, I know it sounds pedantic, but backgrounds do not serve the learning intention. Music is another thing that is extraneous information. Animation. Everything on our presentations should concern itself with explanation, not decoration. Yes, these things might be there to engage the student, but think about it. What are you engaging them in? Not the learning, something else. It certainly doesn't mean that your presentations have to be boring. They just have to be more purposeful in their design. But principle number 2 is the redundancy principle. And this is based on the fact that we learn so much better with images. Research and studies show that when we present students with just text, they're only able to recall 25%, 1/4 of it, and they have no transferability. They can't apply that learning in any way. However, when that text is mixed with images, we can remember so much more, 75%, and we're able to transfer that information and use it. So research shows that the best combination are still images with narration, followed by animated images with narration. But text and narration doesn't work well at all. And this is because of the way that we learn and we process information. We receive information into our brain through 2 channels, the audio channel and the visual channel. When the information comes in through both these channels at the same time, that's really efficient learning and it's easy to process. But when we are processing all the information through just one of those channels, that increases the load, the effort that's required for processing. And so we always need to be very careful about using large amounts of text on the slide, particularly if we're going to mix those with images as well. And that's because we process text as symbols and images through the visual channels. And then we later, after we've been processing it for a while, convert that over to the auditory channels. So when we use text and images, we're pushing all the information through just the one channel. When we've got large amount of text on a slide, we often narrate it too. And the problem with this is, if we narrate at a different speed to the student or child reading it, that creates a conflict in the child's mind. We very rarely read it word for word either. And the small differences from our reading and their own reading of the text can also create a conflict in the child's mind. And that's going to really disrupt and suppress the processing. So we see this quite a lot if we're using resources from Twinkle, because they quite often have to include a script for the teacher. And if we look at our presentations, quite often all that writing isn't really there to support the student. It's there to support the teacher. So take the text out, put it on a separate piece of paper to help you with the narration, and narrate over still images or animated images. The third principle is the signalling principle. And here we are emphasizing the key information. We can do that in lots of different ways. If we are going to use text on the slide, this is really important. So we can do that by underlining, circling, highlighting the text, but also through our narration, using inflection, modulation, and pausing to emphasize the key information. Little example for you there. But another really interesting way we can do this, and something that's really effective, is using a title on the slide. A really clear title activates prior learning and means that everything that follows constructs nicely on what they already know. So make sure you use a title on the slide. Make sure if you are using text that you underline it or highlight the key information and use your voice to emphasize the key information. So the fourth principle is the spatial contiguity principle. Contiguity means close or touching. So that basically means putting things close together in space. So what we really mean here is grouping related information together. And that's because our working memory is limited, but we retain things better in chunks. So if I said to you, remember the numbers 5, 9, 7, 6, and 2, you might be able to remember them all, but we remember things so much better in chunks. And if I was to say to you right now, can you repeat those 5 numbers? I'm not sure all of you could, but you'd be much more likely to remember the number if I said to you, can you remember the number 59,762? because we've chunked the information. This diagram is a really good example of spatial contiguity. The top diagram is much easier for students to process because the labels are directly related to the area of the brain they're referring to. In the second diagram, students have to look at the letter, process that, and then find how it corresponds to the label, and then look back, and there's a lot more processing involved. And when we have spatial contiguity, this has a big effect size on all student learning. And the fifth principle carries on with the same theme, the temporal contiguity principle. And this is about time, making sure that the visuals and narration happen at the same time. In fact, even a delay on the narration of 1/8 of a second could be really problematic for learners. Having the voiceover or narration play before or after the visual can dramatically suppress the learning potential. The sixth principle is the segmenting principle, and here we're concerned with breaking the learning down into much more manageable chunks, being careful that we don't share too much information on one slide. And this is why I get a bit nervous about the number of slides rules. It's really important that we don't try and share too much in one lesson, and I accept that. But by reducing and making a rule about the amount of slides that people are allowed to use, this can sometimes tempt people to cram too much information into just one slide. You can really emphasize this principle for the students by reminding them at the end of a slide narration that if they found it tricky, they can go back and play it again before moving on. I think this is a real consideration for those continuous one-note lessons, and I think it's really important that we think in that context how we meaningfully segment the learning. The seventh principle is the pre-training principle. And here we introduce the students to the trickier vocabulary, to the trickier concepts before the lesson. And this really reduces the intrinsic load when they start the lesson itself. And it means they're much more able to process the more difficult aspects of the lesson. So, those of you who are a fan of flipped learning, this is a brilliant way of bringing it in to reduce the intrinsic load and support students to achieve their full learning potential. It may not be something you do with all the students, but it's been proven to be a really simple yet really effective intervention for lower attaining students. The next principle is the modality principle. Now, our primary channel for learning is our visual channel, and so we learn so well with images. So, cut the text, make the images bigger, and narrate over the top. The next principle is the multimedia principle, and the idea here is that we learn best with dual modality, learning through both the visual and the audio channels. So not having pictures on their own, having pictures with narration, not having narration on its own, always accompanying it with pictures, always making sure you're pushing the learning through both the visual and the audio channel to make learning really efficient. The next principle is the personalization principle, and this is really straightforward. Make sure that your presentation is not too formal in the vocabulary that you use or your style of speaking. Actually, students learn best when it's less formal. Also, students learn best when the narration is on the quicker side. It might seem counterintuitive, but it's true. We actually process things very quickly, and when we talk slowly in order to emphasize our point, it can be really disruptive to student learning. And the 11th principle is the voice principle, and this is all about familiarity. Students know you, their teacher, and they'll benefit from learning from you because they're familiar with you. The worst thing we can do is use synthesized electronic voices, but we're not going to be doing that anyway. So the key thing is, let the children know that it's you that's sharing the presentation, or another teacher that they know that's sharing the presentation, and you'll find this enhances their learning. Now, the 12th and last principle is the image principle, and this might be a bit challenging for some people. And the idea here is that talking head videos are not very effective for student learning at all. So talking head video is when it's just a shot of you talking to the camera. Now, for reasons of well-being, it's really important that the students get to see you and your face, and also to emphasize the familiarity, like we were talking about in the last principle, the voice principle. They'll learn much better knowing that it's you that's leading them through the learning. However, they need the visuals, the diagrams, the visual support with the narration in order to make sure that they're learning efficiently. There isn't much support in your facial expressions. And so make sure, if you're doing a live Zoom session, that yes, you're there to lead the introduction and the welcome, but as soon as you move on to the learning, you get to that share screen. You don't try and talk them through the learning as a talking head. These 12 principles have been proven not just to improve a child's ability to be able to recall their content, but also to be able to transfer and apply it. And it's really important in this current context, learning in the way that our students are, that we think very carefully about how we present the information. And we do use these principles as almost like a checklist to ensure that we're presenting the learning in a way that allows the students to achieve their full learning potential. So these principles are essential, but the 12 principles of multimedia learning concern themselves with the way in which we share instruction. And that's not necessarily the only model of learning that we want. The problem with too much instruction is that it pushes the child into a passive form of learning, where the teacher is sharing lots and lots of information in the hope that the child will remember it. And some children learn incredibly well in that context, but many don't. And all children would benefit from a more active learning environment. But when we talk about active learning, what do we really mean? People interpret this in different ways. We don't mean it has to be physically active, although there are lots of benefits to physically active learning, but it's the cognitive activity that really makes the difference. The more students are cognitively engaged and active in their learning, the less abstract the learning becomes, the more integrated the learning becomes, and the more able they are to apply it in lots of different contexts. So they're much more able to recall it, but they're much more able to utilise that information and make links in later learning too. Now, there are lots of different ways that we can get the students to engage in a more cognitively active way. And I think the first and most straightforward is the idea of embellishing learning, getting the students to embellish their learning. Now, this sounds quite fancy, but it really just means something quite straightforward. We ask them to engage in two ideas in relation to their learning. So the first is, how does this relate to what I already know? And the second is, how is this relevant to me? Now, these two questions tap in to exactly how our brain likes to learn. The first, how does this relate to what I already know, taps into the physical and biological way that our brain learns, of forging connections and constructing new learning on prior learning. And the second, how does this relate to me, taps into the primary motivation for learning, its relevance. The more relevant learning is to us, the more it will be prioritised by the brain. Now, these two questions might land like a clanger in some lessons, so you don't have to actually ask these specific questions, but just create intervals in the lesson where students are forced to engage with these ideas. And we can do that simply by saying, let's stop now, and I want you to think about how you feel about what you've just learned. And by doing that, we're forcing the students to engage with how this relates to what they already know and how it's relevant to them. So it can be done very simply. Now, another really effective way we can get the students to more actively engage in the learning in a cognitive way is to involve problem solving. Now, problem solving is really good because it requires the students to engage with what they already know, and it becomes a really cognitively active way of learning. So we have a fairly guilty tendency as teachers to give the students all the information and then require them to show us that they remember it. But, if we're looking at something like the life cycle of a frog, we can give them the images before we tell them anything, and we can say, well, what order do you think they go in and why? Now, most students can use their prior learning and life experience to know that legs don't fall off the frog, and probably if there are some eggs there, that's the start of the journey, and so they can pretty much get it right. And then it's our role as a teacher to pick up the misconceptions and to slightly steer the learning. But They're going to be building that learning on really strong prior learning foundations, and they'll have engaged really critically in the activity. Recent research found that 70% of what teachers teach, the students already know. So by bringing this problem-solving element into your lessons, you're allowing the students to learn in a really efficient way, and it's a great way of personalising. And thinking routines are designed to achieve the same thing, to get the student to really critically engage in the learning materials, to get them to engage in what they already know, what they already understand, and to start thinking about what they want to know and explore different ways of looking at the material to elicit even more learning. So it taps into that biological and physical aspect of learning where we are creating connections and integrating learning into what we already know, but also taps into our primary motivations for learning. Think about relevance. What do you wonder? What do you want to know? There's absolutely no doubt that learning is a social collaborative enterprise. And that's one of the hardest things to achieve in this current distance learning context. But it's so important because in collaborating, in sharing their learning and their understanding, students have to embellish it. Now, there are lots of different features within different apps and programs that create the sense that students are in the same room at the same time, breakout rooms in Zooms, etc. But even without that, by giving clearly defined roles, we can create a sense of collaboration, but also require the students to engage critically and meaningfully in the learning. We can achieve this sense of collaboration by giving clearly defined roles. They don't actually have to be working on those roles together, they just have to know that they have a distinctly different role and they'll be contributing to a greater sense of understanding. Now, we have to be careful when it comes to collaborative roles. You see examples like, I'm the team leader, or I'm the scribe, I'm the illustrator, I am the facilitator. Oh, and what does the facilitator do? I fetch the pens. Okay. Now, we need to make sure that all of the roles are a driving force for the learning, and that each of the students within the team are accountable, and we create interdependency within the team where no one person can achieve without the contributions from the others. Now, there are lots and lots and lots of different examples of collaborative roles out there. I think this is an excellent one, which is based on the concept of Kagan structures and ensures that every team player is adding something really useful. Phew! Well, here we are at the end of the training, and in this training we have explored what learning is, the importance of targeted learning, the 12 principles of multimedia learning for instruction, and how we can ensure that the way we present learning maximises the student's learning potential, and also ways that we can ensure that distance learning is still active learning and not passive learning.